Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. I've been thinking a lot today about religious questions, not in the sense of my own personal beliefs or thoughts about dogma or dharma, but more about the way institutions function and legitimate or don't legitimate what can count as both orthodoxy and essential belief. For many decades, Christians had enough social power in America that they eschewed political power, sometimes actively. Evangelicals actively often taught that political power was dangerous to their institution because they wanted to be free of political institutions that they had descended from, uh, particularly political institutions that were related to European monarchies. The Reformation, while initially empowering the monarchy against the remnants of the Roman state and the Catholic Church. Um, and I say that advisedly that the formation of Europe was initially about maintaining a kind of vestige or rump position of the spiritual world of the Roman state. When the pontifex was no longer the imperator, so to speak, when the Pope was no longer the emperor and you did not have Caesaro-papism in the West, then the institution of the church was actually somewhat independent, at least in theory, even in terms of its own law, from the secular authority. Now, the idea of the religious and the secular being so split was a much later idea, but the idea of the authority strains, the person who has authority over a spiritual life and the person who has authority over secular life was inherent in Christianity in ways that it wasn't in, say, Buddhist polities, which Buddhist polities usually emerged in empires that were more pluralistic. So only in places like Sri Lanka or maybe Asoka's uh, Murayan Empire in northern India um, and Tibet, maybe Japan, did you have um, Buddhocracies or Dharmaocracies or bhikkhuocracies really emerge. And even then, there was a clear separation between spiritual authority and the king. And you can see this in many books about Asoka in the Buddhist realm and about the relationship of the king to the Sangha, both secular and that, and by me that I meant the laity and the Sangha proper, which were the monks. And to be fully religious, in Buddhist terms, you had to be a monk anyway. In Christianity, that distinction was always a little bit more nebulous, but civil society was cut off from both familial patronage. This was partly due to the clerical celibacy movement popular in the West and not popular everywhere else, I may add. Monks and bishops were required to be celibate, but prebysters and priests were not. Um, but this really created new institutions that maintained a sense of coherent identity for an otherwise dangly bit of geographical landmass that was constantly at war with itself. Now, you didn't come here for a 5,000-foot overview of 2,000 years of Christianity and 2,500 years of Buddhism. Um, you probably came here to get something about left topics, and they are related. And in fact, actually, it's something I want to talk about. Many people misunderstand me when I enforce orthodoxy on definitions and terms. They think that I am saying that we have to just embrace Marxism as classically understood. Um, from whatever time period you think and I'm stuck in. If you think it's 1927 or 1921 or 1890 or 1870, which one you think I am adhering you to. My reasons for precision is not because I actually think that knowing exactly what Marxists think is going to give you an answer to any political question inherently. I don't think Marx or Engels or even the Marxist tradition was given to us by divine revelators who knew everything. And in fact, there's a lot of problematic conflations of normative and descriptive categories that don't admit they are such in Marxism, trying to derive an ought from an is and an inevitability from an ought is a common pattern of thought that one sees in Hegelian dialectics and in Marxist dialectics. And I actually will tell you that I don't think history works that way, that nothing is quite so inevitable. And Marxists have had to adjust their claims about this over and over and over again in Marx's lifetime and after his death. My reason for demanding precision is so that we understand what these people were talking about, not so that we hold to it. In so much that people are doing that, it makes the past a mythic past, which is something unavoidable for human beings. I actually kind of believe that we tend to create narratives whether we want to or not. And I'm not here to become post-structuralist on you and to decry all grand narratives, but I want to point out that those grand narratives shift. So if we look at Christianity today, there's a lot less emphasis on maintaining doctrine and separations from the world, and a lot more emphasis in controlling the world directly, partly because a whole lot of people have left the faith. But who decides what is legitimate in the faith is often actually money, another Marxist import, because money sustains the institutions, particularly after the large community hegemony that churches had in the 20th and 19th century, even after the Reformation, has been largely broken. Churches often are almost like wealth funds. I mean, look at the LDS church. It's got the most liquid assets on the planet. At least the church that's richer than it, which is a Greek Orthodox church, actually is only richer by the valuation of ancient sites in which it controls, which are worth considerable amount of money as long as you don't try to sell them. But and the Catholic Church would be richer, but the Catholic dioceses have independent financial stakes, so we can't count them all together. But after removing those two, the second most rich church is the LDS, and they are clearly the richest in terms of liquid assets. They figured out ways to maintain tithes that other Christians have not. And a lot of what decides the legitimacy of the church is what the donor base will accept. So what will cause you to lose members, but more importantly, donors will cause you to lose. And this became more of a thing in the 90s and aughts when the mega churches replaced a lot of the community churches. It was a consolidation for efficiency. You needed less pastors and less soup kitchens. And you enabled these mega churches to pool resources and have massive buildings and broadcasting spheres and deals with Christian broadcast networks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But their community function, which they had for a long time, even in the relatively decentralized evangelical world, outside of places like Utah, where the LDS have a very strict ward system set up, began to erode, and money began to dictate who could be a decider of what was in doctrine and what wasn't. And from money also came political power. So the massive concerns of what we should be looking at shifted accordingly. And then in 2008, during the economic downturn, we saw a massive increase in unchurched individuals because church was increasingly not something that could compete with the internet, but also not something that had the same social function. It seemed more like an ask and not like a give. Now, when I talk to leftists, they often want people to give to these organizations off the promise of revolution or off the promise of this or that without giving something back immediately. And while some self-sacrifice in some discipline is always required of people, you do have to get something back immediately other than the promise of something in the future. And while the promise of heaven is something that Christians could hold out, they still had to feed mouths and maintain knowledge and do pastoral care in addition to that promise. at no time have they been able to totally escape that role. Not only does it serve as a sort of social legitimation, but it also uh, reinforces their value to the community. Whereas most political asks are just asks, and we increasingly have them in abstract and nebulous terms. People are attracted to power, our historical traditions, our ideologies, even though they can't articulate them, don't really know them, don't interested in reading the text. It puts Marxist and socialist in particular into a bind because, like Christians, they're actually very theoretical and textually driven. Christians are also theoretically and textually driven, believe it or not. Go read C.S. Lewis. Mere Christianity is about like 4 doctrines. That's a textual and ideological concern. One of my critiques when I was a conservative and of Protestantism is that it rendered tradition and lived experience into an ideology, first in terms of just a belief catechism and an interpretation set of the Bible, but then in terms of now social beliefs and social power. And thus you make the image of God in the image of your own political needs and wants and what you want to reestablish. Well, this is also true for leftists and other kinds of secular rightists, etc. We shouldn't see this as solely a function of religion. This is where people like the new atheists went wrong. These social codes are forms of norms that are not inherently backed by force, but are backed by social ostracism and social belonging. Leftists understand this, even though they don't really seem to acknowledge it, because one of the things that they do, or we do, more than anybody else, except for religious people, is try to mine what is acceptable orthodoxy, what is acceptable beliefs. But even then, we have to admit that a lot of that has to do with social status and money. Social reproduction is still tied into economic reproduction, and both are intimately related. They're hard to separate, although they are separate. But if you don't believe me, try being a poor person on a date. You have to ask yourself then, what are the institutional blockages? People say there's no money on the left, and I point out there's tons of money on the left. It's just NGO money, which has millionaires on boards controlling it. Well, a lot of that's going to dry up because that was backdoor related to either the federal government or people feeling like they could clear tax rebates and stuff by supporting these NGOs. It was popular in the American mythology with both liberals and conservatives because it was more public-private partnerships. In that sense, it was in the spirit of Fordism and in the spirit of neoliberalism both. You don't ask the government to do it. You just have the government create it, maintain it, give tax money to it, close the circle, but they're not actually in charge. Now, this diffusion of power may have some benefits, but it also clearly has a lot of externalities, as the economists will say. But we see this with religion too. The institutional legitimacy is based on your ability to socially reproduce yourself. And that also means the ability to economically reproduce yourself. Can you actually support not just your own children? I mean, clearly there's that too. And there's even maybe a biological imperative there, but also people who think like you, people who would share your kinship bonds, people whom would share your modes of creating the world and the relationships you have to the creation of that material goods. Can you reproduce your lifestyle? Which means legitimacy is often tied to money, whether you like it or not, which is why all these things are in flux. If I tried to hold you to 1870s pure Marxism, whatever the fuck that would be, I would be giving you a severe disadvantage in adjusting to the world. But if I am not just trying to read ad hoc to create a new myth for you to go out and proselytize with, I'm being dishonest and it's likely going to backfire. Because a lot of these groups that are purely ideological don't give a whole lot back to the people that they interact with. And if you don't give someone a sense of belonging, you can't socially reproduce yourself, well, you're not long for this world. Go ask the Shakers. They're still around, but there's not many of them. Why? Well, universal celibacy is a definite problem for social reproduction, isn't it? If you ever became a dominant religion, you would cease to exist very quickly because everybody would stop reproducing. And if you don't become a dominant religion, you're such a hindrance to a larger society that it's going to be hard to be attractive. And antinatalist ideas have emerged in religion throughout history, Buddhism, Christianity. I don't think you really see them in Islam that much. You don't really see them in mainstream Judaism or rabbinic Judaism. You do actually see it in some Judaistic split offs, other than Christianity. But there is a sense here that there's a tension between what we come from and where we are. And leftists need to get a lot more real about understanding their social reproduction, because Christianity, when it had social hegemony, it didn't really need political power in the same way. That's what a lot of people miss. When you are dealing in Christendom and there's competition between different types of Christians, there's a reason for them not to seek political power. Seeking political power now, even though there's still such division amongst evangelical and mainline Christians and this, that, and the other, is actually kind of a last desperate attempt to reestablish some institutional legitimacy. Secularity can push back against this, but there's no promise that secular people are going to be inherently any more rational. Look at James Lindsay and Dave Rubin. For the leftist, for the Marxist, for the liberal, even for the conservative, you have to ask yourself, how do you reinvent a tradition, a way of life that can be socially reproduced while also seeking to fundamentally change the way the world operates? Something that has both an ethical, normative, and a political normative force, as well as a fairly valid description of reality. Doesn't have to be 100% true, honestly, to be effective. I would love it. Truth was the only thing that mattered, but we know that it isn't. But can you deal with the truth as it emerges? Can you shift and change? Are your ideas flexible enough to survive? And can they socially reproduce yourself? We're going to see a lot of fundamental changes in what is left wing and what is not, because the institutional supports are going to shift. The NGO supports are no longer there, not in the same way. And they may be reestablished, but that's been the dominant form in America. The long march through the academy, well, even without the political assaults that have happened, you would have an issue there because there's just less kids. Most of the developed world is going to go through a transition to a lower population level. And often it is wanting to stabilize its identity in lieu of that lower population level, making immigration more of a threat, even though it's also more economically important, unless you automate more and more, which also has its own economic consequences and threats. Could be good, could be bad. Capital, I think it'll mostly be bad, but nonetheless, there's stuff you have to weigh out. So belief is tied to Mammon. You can't serve God and Mammon, but you kind of have to make a deal with him. And if you don't understand that, well, then a lot of the shifts in ideology, a lot of shifts in the belief, which seem arbitrary, are going to be a lot harder to explain because they're not rationally explicable, but they are socially explicable. And then there's a lot of liberal and left-wing shibboleths that are about legitimacy and control. They are. I mean, having a left that protects the marginalized, but is okay with protecting the rich marginalized and the privileged elites first makes a lot of sense if you want patronage. It's also a way to alienate a whole lot of people you supposedly care about. Now, the right does that too. There's all kinds of ways in which it does it. We can talk about the way in which the right has actually destroyed Christian hegemony in a lot of ways and destroyed the social basis for it. Yeah, but I'm tired of people special pleading their ideology as somehow a magic way out of the problems of social development and then getting mad when they're not and blaming everyone else in their movement. Leftists hate other leftists. Well, part of why leftists hate over leftists is other leftists often show you the problems in what you're doing and you don't want to deal with it. Anyway, people should study political movements and religious movements because they're not the same, but they're not all that apart. And their social and economic basis explains a lot. They also are in flux at all times. They can die back and come back. Decline is not linear. Development is not linear. It's not even exponential. I know a lot of technologists are like, we have exponential technology growth. Well, you only do in certain fields and then it severely drops off. That's why Kondratiev waves make a lot of sense. But think about that in terms of ideology too. Libertarianism during the beginning of the Obama administration looked like it was the up and coming American ideology. By 2014, it was already conceding nationalism. Today, it seems dead with a few holdouts, maybe as a kind of right wing counter systemic movement to Trumpism. We'll see if it develops. The other one is liberal neoconservatives shifting parties. But nonetheless, all these ideologies and all these nomenclatures are in flux in reality, just like religious beliefs are in flux in reality. Even when they maintain for centuries relatively static doctrines, they don't enforce or understand those doctrines in the same way. Why do you think your politics is any different? Hit the bell, like, and subscribe if you want more. You can find more here. Protect your peace.